So much. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I know it's very early in the morning, but we have an amazing speaker today. I've been reading his work and I just couldn't, I was so excited when he said he'd be willing to do this. It's Dr. Tim Wittig. He's with the Basel Institute on Governance. I'll let him tell you what else he's affiliated with and up to. He's zooming in from Kenya in Nairobi. So I appreciate him taking the time out of his day to do this and share with us how the pandemic and wildlife trafficking all coexist. So Tim, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Greetings from Nairobi, and thanks Regina and ABA for having me this opportunity to talk to you about global wildlife trafficking and how it's being impacted by the coronavirus pandemic, and kind of what the future holds. We expect for wildlife and poaching and global wildlife trafficking. So I'm just going to share my screen to put on the presentation. Okay. Yeah. So, okay. So yeah. So we'll talk today about COVID-19 and global wildlife trafficking, how they're impacting each other. So actually, before I start, let me just introduce myself. My name is Tim Wittig. I work for the Basel Institute on Governance, which is it's a university-affiliated think tank, essentially. Anti-corruption institution and based in Switzerland, although I'm based in Kenya. But for the last 4 or 5 years, I've worked for United for Wildlife, which is a program of the Royal Foundation, Prince William's Conservation Initiative, essentially. And so with that, we've been working with the private sectors and law enforcement on wildlife trafficking. So I run the intelligence sharing system for that. So basically what we do is we consolidate information and intelligence on wildlife trafficking dynamics and actors and who's doing it and how they're doing it. And then we give that, we share that with law enforcement and private sector and NGOs also. I think it's actually first good to start with some basics. Just so that everyone kind of be on the same page about wildlife trafficking and kind of where we're at as far as conservation of wildlife goes. So there's some really shocking statistics, maybe you've seen them, but there's been some reports out in the last couple years that are showing first that there are actually less than half as many wild animals in the world in absolute numbers than there were 50 years ago. So it's an incredible loss of biodiversity and of actual animals in the world. And actually, the UN estimates that there's probably about 1 million species that are currently at risk of going extinct. So so we're facing multiple environmental challenges right now on planet Earth, climate change being one of them, but also there's a serious extinction crisis going on too right now. So wildlife trafficking is a big part of this. And so I just wanted to show you some maps just to kind of illustrate what the scale of what we're dealing with. So these are just population range maps about some iconic species that you'll have heard of and know, maybe follow. So elephant, so you can see just in Africa, African elephant, not showing the Asian elephants, but the African elephant, you can see the decline in elephant range just since 1979. So the lighter shade is how it used to be, and then what's remaining in 2007 is in the darker shade. And actually, it's gotten even much worse because that's before the current poaching crisis started. Tigers, there's only about 100 years ago there were several 100,000 tigers, and now there's only about 3,000 tigers in the wild. There's actually more tigers in the US in captivity than there are in the wild in the world. It's a pretty amazing statistic. So you can see the decline in population range. Lions too. If any of you are readers of Greek mythology, you'll know that there's lions in Greek mythology. That's because there was lions in Greece way back then, and so now obviously very much constricted. And this type of constriction obviously has huge evolutionary impacts because you have all this fragmented habitat, so they're not able to adapt to things like climate change. Rhinos, sorry, same thing. You can see the lines outline the former rhino range, and hippo, and just American Bar Association, also bison. The shade here is where the bisons used to live, and these little dots here are where they're currently living in the wild now, on reserves. So as you can see, major and really kind of world historic declines in wildlife species. This is the context that wildlife trafficking sits in. Wildlife trafficking is not responsible for all of this, obviously. Habitat destruction and climate change and various other things play a huge role, but overexploitation, poaching, wildlife trafficking is also a major part of these species declines. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what we're talking about when we talk about global wildlife trafficking. So humans have been hunting wildlife for forever. I mean, since the beginning of humanity. So probably for 100,000 years in Africa, and also trading wildlife. Sometimes hunting and trading wildlife species to extinction, also over the course of human history. But that's not what we're talking about when we talk about wildlife trafficking. So today we're talking about a industrial scale, professionalized, global and criminal enterprise that's really destroying a huge amount of species, a huge number of species, including many of the ones that are famous, like iconic ones like elephants and rhinos and things like that, but also some that many people may not have heard of before, like pangolin, also various small bird species, reptiles, and also plants, also flora, trees, and endangered species of trees and orchids and flowers and all sorts of everything. So it's a real global crisis, and driving it is this industrial scale, professionalized, global, organized criminal activity. Okay, so just to put some numbers on these scales. So working in any kind of illicit markets, it's very hard to come up with accurate statistics about the size of markets, but there are means for estimating that. So wildlife trafficking is usually estimated. So wildlife trafficking in terms of animals fauna is usually estimated around $15 to $20 billion a year. So it's a big industry, very big. But actually, if you include timber, so illegal timber, you're probably talking 100 to 150 billion dollars a year extra in addition to that. So these, but then if you include all transnational environmental crimes, so illegal logging, wildlife trafficking, illegal logging, but also illegal fishing, and also the real cost to society with this type of activity, such as lost tax revenues and things like that. World Bank did a study last year that I contributed to, which estimated that this is probably $1 to $2 trillion a year for the cost of transnational environmental crime. So that's much bigger than drugs, much bigger than almost any other illicit activity. So organized environmental crime is, I think, a real global scourge when it comes to the environment, and also on the human side. So just to put this in, to use the proverbial iceberg analogy, which I think is good, because what we see usually when we talk about global wildlife trafficking is we see individual cases of poachers or individual poaching incidents or problems in specific national parks, or also or smuggling incidents or seizures, arrests, things like that. And also it's usually seen really as more of like a niche issue only for environmentalists or conservationists. But what we need to see actually is that wildlife trafficking connects very deeply and very directly to pandemics, including the current one, to financial crime and illicit activities in general, transnational organized crime of all types, so lots of overlaps, corruption and kleptocracy, and also from, this may be of interest to some attorneys, to business risks, so companies and investors and things are starting to, it's a good trend, starting to pay more attention to the actual impact they're having on nature. And also wildlife trafficking, because actually there's so much kind of global interest in it, it also creates a lot of pretty unique opportunities to develop positive impacts on nature and society. So there's a strong case, and we'll talk more about this later, that wildlife trafficking actually is an issue that can be worked on, and that you can actually make progress on other issues too. So you can do help on the issue of wildlife trafficking in general, but also help on issues like public health and anti-financial crime, conservation in general, and good governance and things like that. Okay, so I'm not kind of a normal or traditional conservation person. I don't come from like a biology background or ecology background. I actually have a PhD in international relations and worked on terrorist financing for the first half of my career, and financial crime. And actually I came at this because I'm always had a personal interest in the environment and nature. I wanted to work on it. But then actually when the poaching crisis really started in 2008, 2009, then it seemed like there was an opportunity to really make a positive impact using this the skills on kind of illicit networks and things. So it's really something that you don't have to work for a conservation group. You don't have to even work, in an explicitly environmental capacity to really make a positive difference on, which I think is really one of the great things about the issue, and why I'm actually pretty optimistic about it. So in context of the pandemic and zoonotic diseases, so zoonotic diseases are diseases that come from animals. So about 75% of all lethal diseases that infect humans are from animals, or spill over from animals. So estimates are about over 2 million human deaths are caused every year by zoonotic diseases. All right, so in this way, coronavirus, COVID-19 was really not a black swan. It was not an unexpected event. Many people predicted it. Many people actually predicted it to very strong accuracy about exactly how it unfolded. And here you can see a map from 2012. Actually, and I've included an old map on purpose just to show that this has been talked about for a long time. So the deadliest diseases just in this century, in 21st century, HIV, COVID-19 now, Ebola, SARS, the first SARS. So these all come from animals. HIV from chimpanzees. COVID, we don't know exactly, but the hypothesis, this strong hypothesis is from bats or from and possibly via pangolins. Right. Also Ebola from bats. Ebola is from fruit bats, large bats, and SARS from civet cats, and also through a couple other intermediary species. All right. So wildlife trafficking and corruption are their major. So IWT is illegal wildlife trade, just a synonym for wildlife trafficking. Are both major drivers of zoonotic spillover. So for zoonotic diseases, and so this is something that is it's interesting because we've given a lot of presentations on wildlife trafficking over the years, and we always include zoonoses and the risk of pandemic from public health risks from illegal wildlife trade, but it's never actually resonated with audiences. But now obviously it does. So just one statistic that I heard from a French customs officer that they were working with. They did a survey just of the one flight from between Kinshasa and Paris, the direct flight, and they did an intensive survey, and where they searched every bag for a month to see what type of illegal wildlife was there, and they found actually over 50 or 60% of the bags actually had bushmeat in it. So illegal wildlife products. These are like often in West Africa, it's often primate parts, but also other things. And these were being sold in Paris. So that's a huge, also fruit bats and other things. And so it's a huge public health risk, and it's been a huge public health risk for years and years. So what we're experiencing now was unfortunately completely unexpected, and yeah. So So from a science standpoint, what we're actually looking for with zoonotic diseases are what's called novel interfaces. So these are interfaces where humans and wildlife are interacting where they really shouldn't be, in any kind of natural way, or different species of wildlife are interacting with each other. And then, so every animal has diseases. Every animal, there's viruses in every type of animal, including humans. So these are places where they can spill over. So wildlife markets, so this has been a lot in the news, but also I think even more important probably as far as scale goes is destroyed habitat frontiers. So the frontiers of where humans are destroying habitat, wild habitat. So usually from logging or mining, building of roads, urbanization, also industrial agriculture, factory farming things. So these are huge issues for pandemics and zoonotic diseases. And I think, the consensus, the pretty much absolute consensus is that we're dealing with one pandemic now, but there will be future ones unless those novel interfaces are dealt with. Okay. So from more from like a criminal standpoint, wildlife trafficking it's a great business to be in, actually, if you're a criminal, because much better than drugs or a lot of the other things. You can make a lot of money. It's very low risk, so very few people are ever arrested for wildlife trafficking. Very few people are ever investigated. Very few of those are ever arrested. Very few of the people who are arrested ever go to trial, even the ones or are convicted. Even the ones that are convicted, most of them, the vast majority of them, receive very light sentences. Right. So from a criminal standpoint, it's good business, and you can make. So here's just some prices for various types of wildlife, but there's hundreds and hundreds of different types of wildlife that are sold in various ways around the world. And just for comparison, so cocaine, I mean, it depends on what country you're talking about, but cocaine, maybe about $20,000 a kilo, or gold, about $55,000 a kilo now. So as you can see, illegal wildlife compares very favorably to these things, and it's a lot lower risk to be a wildlife dealer than a cocaine trafficker, obviously. Okay, so from a criminal standpoint, there are many laws against in every country. There's laws against illegal trading of wildlife and also forestry offenses. But for each one of those, actually, there's associated offenses that have to do with like corruption, tax evasion, money laundering. So I think this is an important point, is that wildlife crime is just crime. There's violations of wildlife, but wildlife-related laws and forestry laws, but it's also just every wildlife trafficker is also committing usually a host of other crimes. And that's not even talking about when they are actively involved in other crime types like drug trafficking or human trafficking. In the U.S. specifically, there's two federal laws, Lacey Act and Endangered Species Act, as you can see. So, but actually, a lot of prosecutions related to wildlife trafficking in the U.S. are smuggling laws, false statement, conspiracy, money laundering type, which actually usually carry bigger sentences. There's the CITES form. So CITES, UN Convention on Trade in Endangered Species and Flora and Fauna. That's the kind of the governing convention about wildlife trade. Importantly, it's a trade treaty. It's not a crime control treaty. So it has significant limitations when it comes to dealing with wildlife trafficking. Just to give you a little, to zoom in a little bit about how wildlife trafficking converges with other crimes and threat types and societal issues. So this is northern Mozambique, Niassa Reserve, the area in green. It's called Niassa Reserve. It's a very big protected area. I spent a lot of time down there several years ago working with the people there. And it's the size, so the Niassa Reserve is actually the size of Denmark. It's about the size of the country of Denmark. And in 2013, this is the picture I took. This was most of the ranger force there to patrol the whole area. So this is a map we did at the time, ivory trafficking routes in red out of Niassa Reserve in Mozambique. And so here you can see how these ivory trafficking routes at the time overlapped with various other issues. So Pemba, over here is Pemba. That's a big port. This is one of the biggest natural gas fields in the world, actually. So there's a huge amount of gas investment, lots of shipping, international shipping, container shipping, and other things. There's a lot of development aid. This is a very good road that was built by international development agencies, and actually, but that actually improved a lot of the ability of trafficking networks to kind of get closer to demand. There's a big illegal ruby trade, arms trafficking over the border with Tanzania. This is in the news now. It was nascent then, but there's a believed to be Islamic State related jihadist movement in northern Mozambique. Lots of corruption. It's a major heroin import area for Afghan heroin, as is most of the Swahili coast now. And a lot of money laundering through like tourist infrastructure and beach resorts and things like that. So, so as you can see, wildlife trafficking, I mean, this is just one, but there's, you can draw kind of a map like this in many areas where wildlife trafficking is happening. So actually, I wanted to talk a little bit about shark fin. Gina mentioned that this might be of interest to the group. And also, it's a really nice kind of comprehensive exemplar of what we're dealing with wildlife trafficking. So first, actually, I'll start from the bottom here. It's a very complicated legal landscape because in some places, shark finning is legal, in some places it's not. In some places, some species are it's legal to trade, and others are not. And so it's very difficult to control that and regulate that. And the trafficking groups and the criminal groups, they know how to play those jurisdictions off of each other, you know, so to have jurisdictional arbitrage. So the scale is huge. I think this is also a great example of sometimes almost unimaginable scale of these wildlife crimes. All right, so about 800,000 tons of shark fins are traded every year. It's an estimate. I mean, it fluctuates, but and maybe up to 100 million sharks killed every year. And so, yeah, actually, I said this statistic to somebody a couple of years ago, and they said, honestly, I wouldn't even know there were 100 million sharks in the world, you know. And then so actually, there are 100 million sharks that are killed every year just for this trade, right? The demand is so often the idea with the conventional wisdom about demand is that there's a growing middle class in Asia, and that's kind of driving organically the trade in illegal wildlife. That obviously plays a factor, but it's much more the reality is much more nuanced. First of all, it's not just Asia. The U.S. is a huge demand area, a huge demand country for illegal wildlife, mostly from Latin America, mostly smaller species and exotic pet trade and things like that. But the U.S. is a huge market, as is Europe. Germany is actually a very big market for illegal reptiles and other things. And so it's also the Middle East and other places. So it's not only an Asian problem, and sometimes that's how it's portrayed. And also a lot of illegal wildlife trade is actually driven by investors, right? So it's actually driven by people that are trying to market products, right? So it's not organic consumer demand. So what that means is, from a investigation standpoint, it's actually it's a much obviously smaller and more finite group that you can look at, and also tons of convergence with other organized crime groups. So, and I think one of the really interesting things, and this is one of the reasons why it explains the scale of what we're dealing with wildlife trafficking, is that wildlife itself, wildlife commodities, are actually used as a money laundering vehicle for illicit proceeds from other crimes. So shark fins have been used a lot for laundering, for example, drug money, and you know, big narcotics trafficking organizations to launder that. Sea cucumbers. There was a case in the U.S. A couple of years ago about sea cucumbers being used by drug cartels, by Mexican drug cartel to launder a lot of its funds. And this is also a big. There's a lot of overlaps and integration between some of the Chinese crime groups and diaspora business networks in Africa that are also using wildlife as a way to execute capital flight and tax evasion, especially. Okay, so shark finning, I mean, it's a huge industry, and so it's also a great kind of example of a lot of the core issues. So how is wildlife trafficking being impacted by coronavirus, by the COVID-19 pandemic and the response? So we did a paper recently, about a month ago, a little bit over a month ago, making predictions. So they're just straight predictions. It's not a report about what's actually happening. So we just kind of used our knowledge and experience to make some predictions more on the medium and longer term. So what is the future of global wildlife trafficking going to look like because of this pandemic? And so you can see the website's here. You can download it there if you haven't already seen it. But so we came up with 12 predictions. I'll just go through these quickly and then we'll stop for questions. So first, and maybe most immediately, there's wide consensus, and the consensus is only growing, and the fear is only growing, that there's going to be another poaching crisis. So actually, poaching was on its way down in Africa from the heights from a few years ago, and so this is a map of the protected areas in Africa, and so the main issue here is that most conservation in Africa is based on tourism money. So it's based on tourism dollars. Including for government agencies. So a lot of government agencies, a lot of conservation agencies in Africa are actually based on tourism receipts. Their funding doesn't come from the treasury, from the central treasury. It actually comes from tourist receipts. And this has never been really an issue before, but now the tourism is basically stopped in Africa and probably won't come back, at least for a while, and maybe not at the level. So what this means is that overnight, essentially a lot of conservation funding has been eliminated just overnight in Africa. And so, and there's been a lot of chatter picked up through groups that work with informants and things about poaching gangs that are essentially regrouping so that they can take advantage of the situation. Because pretty soon there'll be no funding for rangers, for operations, so fuel for vehicles, for salaries, and things like that. Plus, will be a lot of more incentives for people to poach for money, but also for protein, also. All right. And in the Q&A, we can go into these in more depth if you like. So the second one is that wildlife trafficking will be vulnerable to macroeconomic swings. So essentially, wildlife traffickers are going to be in the same macroeconomic context that we all are. So what this is going to mean is probably like a lot of short-term disruptions to wildlife trafficking, but our assessment is that they're going to return to business, and they're strong as ever after kind of some short-term disruptions. There'll also be a shift, and we already have seen this. So there's already been kind of a strategic shift for wildlife traffickers to sell online, but also potentially at the wholesale level instead of just at retail. So this is a huge issue. A lot of the social media platforms where they're sold do not do a very good job about regulating what goes on there. So it's almost like an open illicit market for this. So this is something that's going to be really big. Also, a lot of wildlife trafficking is done by what's called polycrime networks, so networks that are involved in multiple different types of crime. So maybe they traffic some drugs, they traffic some wildlife, they do some other things. This is a photo here. There's a big bust about a month ago in Uganda. This is a big cyber fraud ring syndicate in Uganda from a Chinese organized crime group. And but they also were trafficking wildlife. So in this raid, the police raided this house, and they found all of the cyber fraud equipment, but also a lot of pangolin and ivory and rhino horn. All right, so we're predicting that this trend will continue, and also the wholesale market for wildlife will consolidate. So this is something that is that will. So what this means is that there'll be the kind of the existing big players. So the way wildlife trafficking is structured from a criminal standpoint is it's not really like a Mexican drug cartel or a Colombian drug cartel. So often in the news you'll see the Pablo Escobar of wildlife trafficking, but actually that's not really accurate because like drug cartels, for example, Latin American drug cartels, they're hierarchical structured, they're vertically integrated, which is why they're so profitable. But in wildlife trafficking, what you see is actually kind of a network, a dispersed network of entrepreneurial groups, right? So it's more of a horizontally integrated business rather than a vertically integrated cartel. So these may be dominant players like in a specific location, but they're not they're not kind of the drug cartel or mafia model. So what this means is that actually the constraints because of the pandemic will probably make that wholesale market, so like in Malaysia, export networks in Nigeria and West Africa, and some of the cross-border networks in China and Vietnam and Southeast Asia. They'll probably consolidate just because that'll be a economically viable position for them to do. There's been also a lot of talk about bans on selling wildlife in Asia and China and Vietnam and other countries. But actually, so those bans, first of all, they're not really bans. They're just restrictions on the type of wildlife that can be sold, where it can be sold, and how, under what auspices. So, no for food, but yes for medicine, or things like that. But these bans, I mean, this is true in almost all cases, not just on wildlife, but these bans, these restrictions will actually create a lot of new illegal business opportunities. So especially around license fraud, permit fraud, because those bans will, those restrictions will say that, for example, you can sell wildlife legally for traditional medicine purposes, but not for food. All right, so that actually creates a nice laundering mechanism to sell illegal wildlife. And we just put out an alert recently about based on some NGO reporting from EIA, Environmental Investigation Agency, about leopard bone trafficking. That leopard bones are actually being used for traditional Chinese medicine, even though they're not legally sold or traded, and especially at the scale that would be required to serve that. So essentially, you're seeing, and this has to do with the next one, is that there'll be an increasingly blurry line between the legal and illegal wildlife trade. Right. So there's a huge legal wildlife trade too, but there's going to be a lot of incentives for illegal wildlife traffickers to use legal supply chains in order to bring their goods to market, and also for legal wildlife traders, so like traditional Chinese medicine dealers, zoos, and like breeding centers and things like that, to use illegal wildlife as part, either to use their legal businesses as a cover for trading things like ivory or things that are just illegal, like rhino horn, or probably more prevalent will be that they're actually using illegal supply to meet illegal demand. So in some cases, it's legal, for example, to sell a certain type of wildlife if it's been captive bred in the country where where you're selling it, but there aren't enough captive bred, or there are no captive bred animals that could ever serve that market, so they source it illegally. This is actually the situation in Germany, where there's a huge amount of illegal wildlife trade that's actually under the guise of being legal, because they're selling legally traded species that are legal if they're captive bred, but there's no, but a lot of these species have never been captive bred, right? And law enforcement, they don't understand all these nuances or specificities, or don't have a way to test whether this bird is actually the illegal bird or the illegal bird, or vice versa, or the snake or whatever. Passenger air used to be a very big mode of smuggling, obviously because of the real big, huge restrictions on passenger air. We work a lot with the transport industry, and on strengthening their networks against wildlife trafficking. And so passenger air, but actually what we're seeing already, and we've seen evidence of this, is that a lot of what was going out on passenger air is now going air cargo, or even maritime, or air express, like express services, right? So some shifting in the dynamics. Something else that is probably good for law enforcement and for investigators is that traffickers will in this pandemic time focus more on the proven smuggling routes and modes, right? So they'll stick with what works basically. So they won't be developing new networks or new people to work with or new people to bribe or things like that. So this is actually something where it creates a real vulnerability for them and a real opportunity if we're able to be proactive about this. All right. Insider threat and corruption risk will significantly increase, so there's going to be a lot more incentive because of the economic issue for people to, so for port officials and government officials, but also companies. So the reason why we work with the private sector so much is because pretty much all illegal wildlife moves commercially, right? So they don't build, for example, like cartels do, they build their own drug submarines, right? So they, or they have their own boats or things like that. But wildlife traffickers, essentially, pretty much all illegal wildlife moves commercially, and a lot of the corruption, the high-level facilitators are vulnerable on the finance side. So that's why we work with banks too. Corruption is a big issue, both on the public sector side and on the private sector side. And so I think this is where we're starting to get, actually, this is why I'm optimistic about things, is that, the pandemic creates a lot of challenges, obviously, for conservationists, especially the overnight evaporation of funding. But actually, I think it creates a lot of opportunities and a lot of vulnerabilities for traffickers, and therefore a lot of opportunities for people trying to stop wildlife trafficking. And again, like I said at the beginning, the people that can play a really huge impact on stopping wildlife trafficking often are not conservationists, are not kind of in a formal conservation role. They work for a shipping company, they work for a bank, they work for a government in a non-wildlife capacity. They're an attorney. So there's, so I think there's, and that's the last part. There's lots of vulnerabilities that wildlife traffickers will be suffering from, both on the enforcement side. For example, a shift to online makes everything surveillable and discoverable about what their activities are, unlike things that are done offline. And also, I think there's ultimately this problem will be solved through political means, wildlife trafficking, because there'll be big shifts in demand. There'll be big shifts in how much resources we actually dedicate to solving this issue. I mean, one of the exciting aspects about wildlife trafficking is that it's a solvable problem, actually. So if we know what to do, we have all the ingredients for success, and it's just a matter of doing it. So what does success look like? So the way I look at it is that we have to reduce the scale of wildlife trafficking to a much lower number. So we'll never eliminate illegal killing of animals, right? So that's not the goal. The goal is to make it so that it's not at the scale where it's causing extinctions, either general extinctions or localized. Also to deprofessionalize it. So like I started with, the problem are not community, local people hunting. The problem is these professional networks and their big corrupt facilitators in both government and in business who are able to do this at scale, right? So the problem is not the local poacher. The problem is not even the person coming to Africa or coming to Latin America or something and putting something on their in their suitcase and traveling with it. It's the huge multi-ton shipments, the 10-ton shipments, maritime shipments that are going, really serving a huge role. And then also on the financial side, the people that facilitate that and finance that. So the middlemen and the facilitators, the people that issue the develop orders for illegal wildlife, the investors essentially. And also on the divest side, the last one is the kind of the broader context of the major investment into things like into industries that are driving the context within which wildlife trafficking is happening, right? And so so I think really rethinking and reimagining how we do investment so that it's more wildlife friendly and less friendly to wildlife traffickers, for example, is a huge part of that. I would say that's especially big in Latin America right now because there's a lot of investment going into Latin America, and to date they haven't been, they haven't suffered the kind of catastrophic situation that Africa has, but a lot of the context is similar to how things were 10, 15 years ago in Africa, where lots of very biodiverse places, and then but then lots of pressure to build roads and develop it and build infrastructure, and then essentially bringing demand and supply closer. All right, then on the opportunity side, working on IWT. So I mean, this is something for, I think, the ABA audience, is that in really whatever organization you work in, whatever context, professional context you work in, there's a role often to play in helping stop wildlife trafficking, and more generally helping promote kind of pro-nature outcomes, right? So just some, obviously the pandemic, ESG, environmental, social governance, and sustainability in the private sector is a big thing now, and I think things are being taken more seriously, and there's a lot of push for better data and better measurement of impact. There's a lot of interest at high levels. It doesn't always translate into action on the ground, but if you can figure out how to leverage that high level interest, you can accomplish a lot. And also wildlife trafficking and kind of wildlife conservation, I would say, is often an easy issue to work on, as in it's like a friendly, benign issue that people are often very willing to work on. And so it's a great thing to be able to, and every little bit that people do on it within an big organization actually often does play a disproportionately large role in helping on the problem. So this is what we've seen with a lot of the big companies that we work with, that they, by reducing their risk exposure, for example, to wildlife trafficking activities, it's actually created kind of a groundswell within the organization to be more sustainable in general, right? So I think it's paying a lot of dividends. So although it's a little weird, I think, to end by quoting yourself, I'm going to do that because I was interviewed in the New York Times recently, but mainly I wanted to underline this point that so there's a big there's big challenges that COVID is presenting the conservation community, but I think I think the pandemic is a time like no other, really, to think very ambitiously and to think about what we really can accomplish if we put not our minds together, because I think we know what to do, but basically act concertedly and coordinated to really make a difference. And I think that wildlife trafficking, I think we maybe are pessimistic about things because of the war on drugs and because of the real big challenges that we've had on nature conservation for decades. But I think we do really have an opportunity to win, to end wildlife trafficking in kind of all meaningful ways, and also to really change how we interact with nature. And I mean, really, we have to, or else we can just expect a lot more pandemics. So I'm actually very optimistic, and that's why it's great to be able to talk to the ABA and new professional audiences. And so I'll end there, open for discussion, and happy to answer any questions. And also after the fact, please reach out. Always happy to talk with people about anything relevant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. If anybody has any questions, you can just unmute your line and go for it.
Thank you, Tim. That was really interesting. My name is Dana Bray, and I had a question about your comments about the usefulness of bans. And we as lawyers, we think about what legal tools could help with this crisis. And it sounds like what you're saying is that if you have a ban that's not absolute, like, I think what's happening in China now is certain consumption of wildlife is banned, but you could still use those same species for medicinal uses. And also we've heard that there's industries that sort of ranch wildlife species, and they're pushing in China to be able to still be able to grow, wildlife for consumption if they're farming them. And it sounds like what you're saying is that if you have legal trade in the same species next to illegal trade, it just creates a cover and an avenue for the illegal traders. And I think that's what a lot of people feel happened with ivory. Like, you can't really have, if you have illegal trade, it's going to give cover to the illegal trade. So are you saying for us as advocates that we should really only be working for bans that are sort of absolute in terms of which species are illegally traded, because that makes it easier for law enforcement to actually enforce them? Or what would you recommend in terms of bans? Because there's a lot of talk about that now.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think there's a simple answer overall for everything. So I think for some species, bans make sense, like kind of absolute bans. So I think like rhino horn, in my view, a very strict international global ban makes a lot of sense, because because there's so much latent demand, basically, that any kind of it would either creates laundering opportunities, or it actually creates new demand, right? Because if people just think, well, that's not something I can buy, then so there's a lot more kind of people that would want it than, but the ban actually helps reduce demand. But then I think there are other species where having well-regulated trade and well-governed and well-controlled trade is fine, actually, and actually it doesn't, and it's actually maybe good for the species, right? Because then actually gives a reason to conserve the species, right? So one of the but the big if there is, like, can there be well-regulated markets, for example, in China, right? So, and I think this is one of the lessons from the first SARS, is that the reason for the first SARS pandemic was because of these, poorly regulated, poorly controlled, very unhygienic wildlife markets, right? And then so China at the time kind of cleaned things up for about 6 months to a year, and then kind of went back to the way it was, right? And then so now, but I think now, maybe the government of China is much more serious about doing this, so I think maybe we have a chance to really make those, well-regulated trades. So I think probably just to sum up, I think it's probably how, like, can the legal trade be well-regulated? So, for example, like in the US or in Europe, in general, the trade in wildlife is, generally well-regulated, well-governed, because most things, or a lot of things are. And then, but in other places, it's not like that. So sorry to not give a clear answer.
No, thank you so much. That's really helpful answer and great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Tim. This is Joan Schaffner. And just to follow up, and this is probably a very naive question, but can you give an example of of the species where you say regulated trade can actually help in their conservation efforts, just to give a sense of how that dynamic works?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I would say one of the biggest, a far bigger problem than wildlife trafficking is habitat destruction, and which is really a clearer way to say that is land use decisions, right? And so, if trade in wildlife helps conserve land, then that's good for conservation, right? So this is why, like, a lot of conservationists are actually, trophy hunting and trophy tourism is actually, it's part of the conservation toolbox. Not really because the money goes into conservation, because often it doesn't, it's just stolen, but because for a lot of this kind of less desirable land, it gives the land a use. And then, I mean, there's on like specific species, there's species like the Vincua, I think that's how you pronounce it. It's a sheep, kind of a mountain sheep in South America. That's kind of a famous case. Also, potentially with the traditional Chinese medicine, because that is, those supply chains are, a lot of them are wildlife derived. So I think that's a very good opportunity to engage with the Chinese government, because the Chinese government are actively promoting traditional Chinese medicine as kind of a nationalistic way. So I think they haven't really taken that seriously, that this is provoking illegal trade in it. So that has potential. But there aren't that many examples on the species specific level. It's more about land use, right? So maybe I think this is why conservationists need to take this opportunity to rethink a lot of things, because maybe that's there's some debate about maybe species specific conservation is not all that successful, which is what a lot of people do, so maybe it should be more about like habitat or ecosystem oriented, because then you could look at it more holistically and prevent a lot of this development that's happening that's actually destroying a lot of different species.
Thank you.
Could I actually, if there's not another question, could I actually ask a question? What is the ABA's interest, or attorneys? I mean, from the legal profession's standpoint, what are your interests in wildlife trafficking? I'd be actually really interested in that.
This is Regina. So for me, it's actually because of how it converges with, because I do international criminal law. So for me, it's how it converges with other like criminal entities. So and how they can facilitate more crimes. So for instance, maybe militaries that are out there allowing for the trafficking of animals, because then that feeds into how they are able to sustain themselves to then commit genocide, crimes against humanity, things like that. Or even, how terrorist groups will use it, or organized criminal groups will use it, like you've highlighted. So for me, that's that. And besides the fact that I think it's important that we have wildlife and they get to live, I'm curious what everybody else's interest in it is as well.
Yeah, Tim, well, I come at this, I'm not so much a wildlife person as an animal welfare individual, focused on sort of the lives of the individual animals. And I know there's been sort of this somewhat of a disconnect historically, although I think that's starting to change with this notion of sort of compassionate conservationism for the last decade or so. But just the notion of how, especially illegal wildlife trafficking, affects the welfare of the animals, especially if they're depending upon, of course, if they're killed, but depending upon if they go into the exotic pet trade or other types of avenues, that's sort of a major concern for me. And the thought is ways in which we can prevent the sort of animal welfare issues through regulation of trade more effectively.
Hi, this is Elizabeth Niles. I'm a white-collar investigations lawyer, and so this isn't really my day job at all, but I feel very passionately about wildlife conservation and was excited to see this program on the ABA's website. I've done some pro bono work in this space, and I'm just trying to figure out ways to get more involved and do what I can to help.
Great. Yeah, and I think, that's one thing I've really noticed working this field for about 7-8 years now, but not coming from, I think like a lot of you said, like just coming at it from more of like a personal interest. Initially was, it touches on everything, so and that works both ways, so you can actually, there's a gateway into this issue for, really from almost anywhere. And that's really one of our kind of core missions with United for Wildlife is kind of uniting mobilize and helping mobilize in a meaningful way non-conservationists, non-traditional people, but that can really make some conservation outcomes. And also just a commentary on kind of the conservation world. I think this is one of the real limitations of it, having worked for an NGO also before, like about 5 years ago in Africa, is it's kind of a very kind of relatively closed, relatively incestuous group, that like kind of says that we're the experts in this and everything needs to go through us. But actually, I think my philosophy is that nature, wildlife should be on everyone's agenda, And, one of the really interesting things politically is that I've never actually seen, I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I've never seen an issue that is truly bipartisan like this, and that wildlife trafficking specifically. And so, because I think people of all stripes, they come to it from very different places of origin, but they all actually end up at the same place. So it's a really interesting thing. So I think kind of ambitiously, I think we could do this for conservation in general, wildlife in general, nature in general, habitat conservation and animal welfare, all of these things. So I might be delusional, but.
No, I think that's what we need to hear, is that we can do something about it. Well, if there's no other questions, I think Tim will let you go, and we have this recorded. So for anybody on who thinks that other people can benefit from the program, that would be amazing to share it. And we all have your contact information to reach out to you. Anybody else? Joan, Dania, anything you want to close with, or?
Well, this is Joan again. Yeah, thank you, Regina. I did want to mention something, actually a huge thank you to Regina. One of the reasons she mentioned to you, Tim, that shark fins might be of interest to us is because Regina worked on putting together a resolution that will be presented to the American Bar Association's House of Delegates in August. And the reason I mention that is, one of the things that I'm thinking, and several of us I think are thinking, is how can we as an organization, as the International Animal Law Committee, of the ABA, do something that would be helpful, right? To promote a variety, whatever efforts that we're thinking of here. And this is one way that we think we can be helpful, and that is to have the ABA take a stance. The House of Delegates, they actually adopt a resolution, and this particular one just promotes the total ban on the export, import, or sale of shark fins. And then the idea would be, of course, that once the ABA has adopted this resolution, that advocates around the world can potentially utilize that as a way of helping to enact laws nationally and internationally to promote that. And I was just, I don't expect you to have a specific answer right now, but maybe we can chat a little bit later, is if you have thoughts as to how how we might as an organization, as a committee within the ABA, impact this in a specific way, other than perhaps through these resolutions. I would love to chat with you about it.
Okay, great. Yeah, maybe we could arrange a time to do that. Yeah, because obviously I think there's a lot of potential, but I don't know offhand specifically. But
right.
But yeah, let's maybe we could just arrange another follow-up.
Cool.
That'd be great.
And this was a great presentation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and thanks for coming.
Thank you, Gina, for putting it on.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Tim. Have a great day.
All right.
Thank
You too. Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much. Bye.
Bye-bye.